So let me welcome you all once again, because this is the formal start of our discussions. And on behalf of both ORF and TTCSP, let me formally welcome you, and hopefully we have a very long day ahead of us. So hopefully we'll have productive discussions over the next few hours, and take this discussion, which I think we have started in the opening panel, forward in terms of more substantive and more focused engagements on particular issues. And we start with the panel on India, and how India in particular looks at this period of what has already been described by our first set of speakers as a period of transition, as a period of turbulence. We don't know where we are going. We know that the old order is not working, but what is coming we are unsure about. And how does India look at this flux, and how does India assess its strategic challenges in this age of flux, is the question we are posing for this panel. And we have two very interesting speakers, one very seasoned follower of Indian strategic thought, very important participant in that discussion over the last few decades, I would say, Brigadier Arun Sagal from Delhi Policy Group, and a very fresh emerging voice thinker on these issues, Dr. Jash from Clause. And I think it would be interesting to hear if perhaps there is a shift here from one generation to the other, or perhaps, as we often say, strategic context remains the same for India. But I think it is an interesting discussion to open the day, because I think it then takes us into more specific discussions later on about where perhaps what role Indian think tanks can play in shaping that discourse that India is grappling with today. So let me begin by inviting Brigadier Sagal for his opening remarks before I invite Dr. Jash.
Thank you, Harsh. Thank you for those words. One is getting old in these things now, and I will start with echoing some of the remarks made earlier this morning that about the global order and this distortion in the global order, etc. But I like to focus on elements of the transition in the global system from a very, very Indian perspective. I start by saying is that there are the emerging contours of the global order are marked first by what I call an economic multipolarity in the terms of critical shifts of economic activity and the contributions to the global GDP by the emerging economies. And this is something which we need to take cognizance of. The second aspect which I talk about is the whole issue of there is normally a perception of military unipolarity in the global system. I'm afraid that military unipolarity is also under challenge today with the growth of the Chinese military power and enormous capacities and advancements being done by Russia in terms of developing its conventional and nuclear capabilities. So what we are seeing, and added to that is whole illusion, and as we have seen in the interventions in the last couple of years, of leveraging of power. The whole notion which the world needs to understand is that there is a lack of credibility in leveraging of power. You saw what has happened in Syria, you saw what happened in the Middle East, you saw what has happened in Afghanistan. For 19 long years, the United States, the world's largest power, has been involved in Afghanistan. And yet, no end to conflict. The same thing happened in Vietnam. So the question today is not so much of power per se, but ability to leverage power. And the last issue is politically the world is confused rather than being orderly or structured. As mentioned, it is marked by populism, protectionism, and nationalism. It is the imbalance between distribution of economic, military, and political power in the world that is at the source of the current sense of insecurity. And we need to take cognizance of that. So this brings to forth the debate about turbulence and transition in the world order that essentially centers around the nature of changing balance of power and the possible contours of power transition. Make no doubt about it, please, that the sovereignty issue, which we have not discussed this morning, remains central to the nation states. The coalition of powers will be done in relation to what the nation perceives as its own strategic interests and how we further those strategic interests. So to that extent, there will be contestation in the power structures in the world. And as that contestation we are seeing in terms of what is happening between the United States and Chinese relationship, and to that, to a lesser extent, between what is happening between the United States and the Russian relationship. And here, I would like to talk about the state of play in Asia, and I will focus my remarks largely to the Asian continent because I believe this is important for particularly for the international participants to understand how we perceive Asia. From the Asian perspective, the state of play is marked by growing competition and divergence of interest between China on one hand, which sees the current scenario of declining US influence and power as a historic opportunity. It's undertaking major economic infrastructure and military initiatives aimed at extending the strategic periphery and securing economic and military domination of Asia as its extended periphery. Only 2 days back, a report has come out of the impact of BRI in Asia, and the central thing emerging out of the report is that on one hand, there is a decline in perception of American power and influence as seen by the Southeast Asians, and the other hand is that there is a growing enormous influence of China. Both the Southeast Asians are trying to, they are concerned about this or they are grappling with it. On the other hand, we are seeing that the Trump administration, despite the dilly-dallying of the resets and all that of the past, is now effectively hardening its posture towards China, which the US now regards as a revisionist power seeking regional hegemony in the Indo-Pacific, with long-term aims to displace US as the preeminent global power. This is being contested. And if you heard the first statement of the new acting defense secretary, it was all about China, China, China. So the issue basically is this: the battle is being joined. And we see three-pronged approach of the new US administration, of the current US administration, that is compete, constrain, and contain. US, apart from direct contest with China, the US is also re-energizing trilateral and quadrilateral dialogues to operationalize joint Indo-Pacific strategies in conjunction with its allies, that is Japan, Australia, and a partner, India. Therefore, what we look at it, from my perspective, Indo-Pacific has emerged as a principal arena for strategic and economic contestation, and it comprises three distinct theaters. The East Asia Pacific, which is the eastern part, which is United States dominated, United States alliance dominated, relatively stable, but has two flashpoints. One is the Senkaku Island issue, and the second is the Taiwan. And then we have the Southeast Asia, which is a connector of the East Asia to the Indian Ocean, which is an area of serious contestation, and where the chips are being controlled and by the Chinese domination and Chinese militarization, for which the alliance partners have little answers. So in fact, we believe that South China Sea is an effectively lost territory to the Chinese domination. And then we have the Indian Ocean, which is the largest trading and energy route of this area, and that again is becoming an area of focus of Chinese go west policy, and which will in future will become an area of serious contestation. This area is important because it's an important trade route, it's an important energy route. So therefore, what we are looking at is there is a transition of power in Asia that is taking place, And that transition in power is being contested. China is trying to break out, as part of its breakout strategy, is moving from a continental construct to a more maritime-oriented construct, and that you can see it in terms of its entire maritime strategy and its naval capacities and capabilities. On the other hand, the dominant powers are people who thought that they would be able to bring a balance, regional balance and order in Asia, as also create a cooperative security architecture, are losing out, and they do not have the capacities to deal with this growing challenge. So, and now, as we see in the last act, the recent act of 31st December, in which where the Asia Assurance Act, where the Americans are now trying to come back and try to be a reckonable player, that remains to be seen. So, how does this impact India? Let me just highlight some points. Firstly, India looks upon itself as an integral component of the emerging regional system, an important element for achieving strategic balance in Asia. As a rising power, it remains more internally oriented. Its traumatic colonial past has instilled a conception of sovereignty, peaceful and rule-based order on the lines of cooperation rather than competition. So from Indian perspective, while it wants to be a major player, but it remains internally oriented and believes in rule of power rather than competition. Its image is not in consonance with those of the traditional global powers. Therefore, from Indian discourse on globalization and world order is not a revisionist but based on what can be termed as a reluctant and circumspect foreign and economic policy changes to advance its material and strategic interests. These are driven by domestic burden of managing order in a chaotic democratic system, understanding the given current comprehensive national power and its ability to leverage the same, and its capacity at the most is to veto the key global governance issues, but not yet powerful enough to assume the mantle of upholding order. There is a certain degree of both righteousness and understanding of Indian capacities and capabilities. We cannot veto. We have at best a veto role in the global governance. We are influencer of global governance. We cannot be the shapers of global governance. When we hear all these issues of how India should play its role, we should be cognizant of India's inherent capacities and capabilities. There is little cultural motivation for ambitious internationalism. So what are India's predicaments? The key assumption for India post-Cold War thinking centered around the reality of a unipolar world. Our entire post-Cold War thinking was centered around unipolar global order. This led India to gradually integrate itself with the US-led world order. However, the diffusion of global power and disintegration of unipolar consensus is now forcing India to reimagine its position. India is adopting a multi-dimensional approach that recognizes diffusion of global power and interests. India's interactions with competing global powers provide an insight into Indian thinking and reflect its perspective. These are upholding of international order in sync with Indian interests, free and open order with focus on integration of global commons. People talked about it this morning. Legitimizing multipolarity and inclusive security architecture on the central norm of upholding sovereignty. Developing transparent and rule-based connectivity, architecture, and regional financial institutions that are responsive to the needs of the global South. Therefore, based on the foregoing central theme, the Indian foreign and security policy is regional and global cooperation rather than rivalry. The central theme is compete but not contest. And lastly, I come to the key security challenges. India is both a maritime and a continental power. Its key challenges lie in balancing relationships between the United States and maritime democracies on one hand, and a continental Asia comprising China and Russia on the other. Juggling these relationships will be a key challenge for India. Regionally, China remains a fundamental concern strategically, security and in defense, even as it remains as an important trading partner. India will have to face and do a balancing act in maintaining relations with multilateral forums such as United Nations Security Council, WTO, security of global commons, upholding international law, and protectionism, as also in G20. There is a huge concern which India will have to deal with of the Chinese successful inroads along India's eastern and western borders, which acts as a pincer that constricts India's strategic space. The interesting thing is India has better relationship with ASEAN and in West Asia as indeed as it has its neighborhood. We have a very strongly contested neighborhood. The concern of India of Chinese go-west maritime policy will further vitiate India's security environment, and this challenge is becoming more and more significant as the days go by. Strategic partnership with ASEAN Quad will require creative engagement in the backdrop of growing Chinese influence. India faces multiple challenges in the neighborhood, largely driven by Chinese influence and their balancing strategies. This will require sustained and dynamic engagement at times what has been referred to as a dynamite diplomacy. You have to take hard steps. AFPAC remains a major challenge. PAC, despite change in government, continues to play a duplicitous game, and Afghanistan will become an important challenge, owing to the internal implosion, drawdown of US forces, and combined role of China, Pakistan, and Russia. And lastly, are important economic issues which India will have to grapple with. RCEP, we have to find an answer, although we have been moving forward on this issue, but we have still not found the answer. Our basic concerns remain unaddressed. And secondly is our trade relationship with the United States, which is also not the best. And then remains the challenges of managing Chinese BRI and the World Trade Order. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir. When Brigadier Sagal was talking of fluidity and India's sort of attempt to balance, one is reminded of the recent G20 summit, where the imagery was very interesting, that the Indian Prime Minister, on the one hand, was attending a trilateral with the Japanese leadership and American leadership, and on the other was participating in the Russia-China-India trilateral. So I think it shows in some ways the pivotal role that India has in the global order at this point. Perhaps you have different power centers, different coalitions trying to attract India, but also I think it's some way a sense of unease with the present global order, where you have to be with multiple partners at the same time. With that, let me invite Dr. Jash for her comments before I open this up.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I would like to extend my gratitude to TT, CSP, and ORF for giving me this opportunity. And Brigadier Sagal has already painted the bigger canvas. So I'll do my bit and squaring down on the way India is maneuvering itself. I'll like to start with the very quote that, with great power comes great responsibility. So in these turbulent times, India, being a rising power, is challenged by two very critical factors. Firstly, acting responsible, and secondly, becoming a responsible stakeholder. So these two parameters actually put you in that radar of where you are in these emerging times. And the very interesting fact that India, rather than acting similar to how any great power would have acted, for instance, as history shows, that aggression has always been synonymous when you emerge to be a great power. Howsoever, in case of India, though not a great power, but it's making its headway, India has acted a bit different. not taking over the hegemonistic mantle, but laying its own footprints, and which I would like to highlight under four precedents that India has set. Firstly, its own aspirations of being a leading power rather than jumping into a great power dynamics. That's where India has taken a lead. Secondly, the idea of inclusivity that India promotes and propagates, which sets it apart from any other country. Third is playing within the rules of the world order and adapting to it. And fourth and most importantly, yet having its own independent approach. I think so these four factors make India different in the way it is emerging in the larger discourse of the changing world order. So under this, the bigger challenges that India faces is undoubtedly, if you come into the contours, Pakistan has been a constant irritant, not a strategic challenge, but an irritant for India. So India's strategic challenge undoubtedly is China. And why I say so is because of the aspirations, the very question that can two tigers sit on the same mountain? In case of India and China, the answer is no. Till now, this phrase was often cited in case of China and Japan. But now, if you look at Asia or the larger discourse of Indo-Pacific, it very much applies to the case of China and India, where the answer is no, because there is greater competition. One is already a risen power, one is an emerging power, very different parameters, how they envision the world order. Because the primary challenge lies in the way China sees Asia. Because for China, it looks at an unipolar Asia and a multipolar world order. This itself brings into forth the discrepancy between these two powers. So that's put into context the crux of the matter, that it's more of conflict than engagement. Though in the recent trends we see with the Wuhan spirit, we see that, as it's said, that India and China are witnessing the best of times. Where I would like to differ that it might be the best of times on the surface, but the inherent problem still remains. The border dispute is a perennial problem, and going with China's behavioral dynamics, China likes to test your resolve. China did it in Doklam, howsoever the results were not the same as was witnessed in South China Sea, because China itself got surprised with India taking a strong stand. So somewhere its own calculations were marred. Is there another chance of China taking India by surprise? Of course, now the stakes are much higher and the chances are much higher. It's just that China awaits the right time, and it also believes in reciprocity. So if India has taken you by challenge, so there is greater chances that the way China is going to take you, by surprise in the recent future. So how the dynamics will unfold is something we need to look at. So India needs to be very cognizant of the fact that how to read the adversary better. So further reading in between the lines, and rather acting more proactive rather than reactive. This has been the biggest challenge for India, and that has somewhat pulled it down in its own stature. So I feel, given the current dynamics, this is the best of times, so why not you put your sources at play, act more proactive. Don't wait for your opponent to strike at you and then you expedite. Rather, you should be proactive in your own vision and action. This is both a challenge as well as an opportunity for India in the current dynamics. And so in doing so, what are the institutions or agencies that India needs to look at? Firstly, you can't sustain acting out of the order, and no more an isolationist policy can apply. Furthermore, India's importance has risen with time, and most probably, I think so, Doklam was that catalyst that raised India into a different bar altogether. And now great powers are rather vying for India's approach in the larger Indo-Pacific region. For instance, US demands a greater role from India in South Asia. China somewhat is trying to get India into its own dynamics, as it has already roped in Japan. And India being one of the arch opponents against Belt and Road, given its own key national interests. So India again has set example for other countries. Because I also would like to argue that in today's world, it doesn't matter whether you are a smaller country or a larger country. Rather, it's the smaller countries who are actually playing the game, and they are taking precedent from this. And you see the way the Belt and Road is facing its own challenges in the current times. So that itself has acted as a setback for China's grand vision. And so in this perspective, what India needs to do is, firstly, India needs to set its own house in order. House in order, as Brigadier Sagal has already said, that your imminent challenge lies in your own neighborhood. India has always been quite ignorant or rather very egoistic in dealing with its own neighborhood. That's where the change lies. India needs to change its own calculation. And because you know, ignoring your own neighborhood or periphery has given leeway to the other actor to get in. That's where China comes in. And if China is befriending, how do you get your own periphery or house in order is the challenge for India, where India needs to be proactive and act different. How it now gets into it is it's difficult and challenged because many opportunities have been missed. So rather than looking at the larger international picture, India needs to first start from the scratch, that is putting its periphery in order, dealing with the smaller countries, which are more important than any great powers. So I think so the challenge for India therefore lies in, firstly, periphery, that is maintaining or working on your own stability with your immediate neighbors. Because if your house is in order, no one can take advantage of it. And you know, nowadays, it's no more going to be an all-out war. It will be a proxy war or a kind of hybrid war, or for that matter, information warfare. So who plays around is very important. So you need to be very cognizant of the fact that who are your friends and enemies. And there's also a statement that there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies in international relations. So this again puts everything into a state of flux. So I would like to conclude that India needs to get more proactive rather than reactive. India needs to act much bigger by giving due credence to its own neighborhood. The size doesn't matter, but it's the growing strategic importance of the country. So you also need to change your own rules of how you play the game. And third is how you deal with China is the bigger challenge. So though we are looking at engagement, but we also have to keep our national interest, which is at the apex. So how do you bring balance into these two very contrasting quarters is the bigger challenge that India is delving into. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrita. So I think it shows that Indian think tanks are doing their job well, because the Wuhan spirit clearly has not infected the Indian thing. So there's a very healthy competition going on here between what some of us are sitting here are suggesting and what perhaps the policymakers are trying to say, and that perhaps, Jim, you would be happy to note that this is very healthy for Indian think tank world. But with that, I think one point that was perhaps has been made by both the speakers is about how the structural realities are still defining Indian worldview on what the global order look like and what kind of coalitions, what kind of actors India would like to associate itself with. And I think China looms so large on the horizon for Indian policy, especially in the foreign policy realm, that we are, I think, looking at the rise of China and the implications of the rise of China, still trying to ascertain where clearly that the focus should lie for Indian policymakers. So I think the questions that perhaps we can talk briefly about here in this, for the next few minutes that we have for this panel, it should involve perhaps if we are looking at an international order that is being redefined by China's rise, the scale and scope of China's behavior, then what sort of coalitions, what sort of instrumentalities are available for Indian policymakers? What sort of engagement with China or without China allows India that kind of leverage that Brigadier Sagal was talking about? And I think by and large, it also involves not simply thinking about your own neighborhood. Of course it does, as Amrita talks about, but also engaging, I think the point earlier was made, what do you do with organizations like BRICS? How do you, if China and India are to be looked at in the way that perhaps we have looked at, the two speakers have looked at, then what happens to some of these organizations, and what happens to some of the challenges that that we have talked about in the first panel? So with that, let me open this up for your questions, comments, and observations, and we can have a few rounds. I think 3 questions per round. Sir.
Yes, thank you. Pleasure to be here, and I think it's a very good initiative to have this think tank forum here. Seen from Europe, of course, it's India is a bit big absentee in this entire debate, at least if I look at it from Brussels. But let's say I had 2 specific questions. First of all, let's say to Arun, let's say if you look at it from Europe, again, let's say the big problem in the region is an element in Asia which you didn't mention, is the Gulf and the Gulf countries. If I look at, for example, what is happening around Iran, around Qatar's relationship with Saudi Arabia, and also if you know, let's say that there is lots of power in the region, money, lots of armies, extremely strong armies. So, I mean, seen from Europe, let's say one of the most, certain sources of conflict in the world in the years to come is in that region, as we've seen already. Also, we know, let's say, that the biggest sources of conflict today are in Syria and in Yemen, let's say, seen from a worldwide basis. So what is the relationship between, say, first of all, how do you see the Gulf in the role, let's say, in the Indian Ocean? And then what is India's role specifically, let's say, with the Gulf countries? And then secondly, of course, as I'm coming from a European think tank, nobody has mentioned the EU. Of course, you may all love, let's say, but this is an important issue because the EU just concluded a new cooperation agreement at the end of November with India. And yes, I mean, in Europe, China is a big issue of debate as well. India hardly comes up. How does it come? Let's say, why is it that the EU is not seen as an credible actor over here?
Yeah. So one of the major coalitions is next door in this neighborhood, which is called SARC. I'm surprised that nobody has mentioned this, and I'm wondering whether it is still alive or dead. You know.
Okay.
Good question. I don't think anyone knows. Someone?
Yeah, Vasan. One question each to Brigadier Arun Sagal and one to Dr. Amrita. To Amrita, I know you did lay a lot of emphasis on the neighborhood. The point is there are limitations to what India can do, particularly the kind of inability to fund them. With the economy that's 5 times the size of India, China has a lot more that it can do in our neighborhood, and there's not much we've not been able to do in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka. In most of the cases, it's some local conditions that have either given you the advantage or disadvantage. So how in this situation can you address the issues of maritime neighborhood? It's pointless talking about soft power because it's got its own limitations. Culture, history, yes, it's got a place, but it's hardly has any influence in the present day governance. But also on talking about neighborhood, you could also, I'm sure, talk about the neighborhood in the maritime neighborhood in terms of Gulf, in Africa, etc., where again, our engagement has been very limited. The question to Brigadier Sagal is, we acknowledge that it's China, there's the elephant in the room or the dragon in the room or whatever. There are again limitations in terms of alliances. Yes, we are talking to Russia and China on one hand, we are talking to America and Japan on the other hand. How are you going to balance this out? Yes, you have a centrality in the Indian Ocean region, you got a geographic advantage, yet there are serious issues in terms of your own capability. You can't do it alone. So what are the alliances that you recommend that must be used for countering China? China, which is now under pressure from Trump, is increasingly looking at India to see, how we can engage with India. Is it an opportunity or is it a disadvantage?
So let's have this first round.
Okay. Thank you for your questions. Coming from the gentleman from European Union. So, you're right, Gulf region is important to India, but there are two elements of the Gulf region. One is it's a source of our energy requirements. We, as you were well aware, we get about 84% of energy from there. But that energy flows from aside important sea lines of communications in the Indian Ocean, and we have reasonably robust relationships with the Gulf countries. Our Prime Minister has gone ahead and one of the few governments who have done an extensive engagement of the Gulf region, and the second issue is that we have, for example, interesting aspect is that we have imposed or we have persuaded the Americans not to apply sanctions on India vis-a-vis the Iran issue is concerned. We are outside the sanction regime as of now. So the issue is that we are constantly aware and we are juggling our cards well to ensure that we do not fall prey to this kind of behavior from the other side. The second aspect is 6 million diaspora. It's important for us. It's important for us that they bring in a huge amount of billions of dollars worth of return to India. So we are not saying that it's not, but when we look at our security challenges, the larger of the security challenges is that we don't, I mean, at least from my perspective, I see it's a manageable challenge. We have a multilateral relationships. We have a multi-engagement policies with the Gulf, and by and large, we are being able to manage these relationships. In the same vein, Chabahar is an important thing. Starting on this month, we have a new organization, Indian organization, which is managing the port. And the connectivity to Central Asia through Afghanistan is an important aspect. Despite what President Trump has said, India continues to be an important social development partner of Afghanistan. And also, right now, we are also trying to provide some minimal military assistance to upgrade the capacity of the Afghan forces. Now, as far as the European Union is concerned, frankly, we recently held discussions with our European Union partners, particularly looking at the combined role in Asia, and we had people from France and Germany. We expect that kind of European Union relationship from Indian perspective to come forth in the Indian Ocean security dynamics, particularly in the Indian Ocean security relationships. We are also looking at the European Union from the perspective of supporting the larger security architectures that are on the cards, and that answers to Commodore Watson's question also, that we are trying to look at. We are trying to look at a multi-dimensional security architecture, and we are in discussions with the Americans on this, at least my think tank is in which we are looking at security architectures around the quadrilateral, but not entirely inclusive of quadrilateral, but using quadrilateral leverages of area-based security architecture. For example, looking for a security architecture around the maritime ASEAN region, which includes Philippines, Indonesia. Then we have come out with a recent policy paper on the role of the maritime democracies in Indo-Pacific, in which we have talked about three tiers, or like we have the three island chains in the Indian Ocean. One connecting from the east coast of India, going up to the Andaman Nicobar Islands, onto Indonesia and onto Australia. The second is along the west coast, coming down to Maldives and going further down south, and one on the east coast of Africa. Now, these are the kind of island chains where we are looking for specific partnerships and specific relationships. There is a talk, I can only say there is a talk at this point in time, of having a Malabar series of exercises in Western Indian Ocean. So there is a lot being done, and we are also looking at streamlining the issue like the MDAs, streamlining the fish hooks, those kind of systems to finding out the role, the existence of American submarines, Chinese submarines, etc. On the SARC, I don't know about the future of SARC, sir, but we are trying to work out an alternative arrangement called the BBIN and the BIMSTEC, because the intransigence of Pakistan will continue. We don't see it changing in any near future. I have been personally for the last 8 years in a part of Track 2 with the Pakistani military and Pakistani nuclear establishment in military to military CBMs and nuclear CBMs. We don't see very much of the future, although we are now trying to ease out things by looking at lexicons and common understanding of basic issues, but we don't see it happening. On the BBIN, we have had some successes. We have done, from my organization, we have done 8 conferences, and on BIMSTEC, we have done about 4 conferences. So we are trying to create an alternative architecture whose value system we hope Pakistan will come to realize and may become, because this whole issue of trade and talks with India is an important aspect, but it falls short of our expectations, because when we talk about trade and talks, we are also looking at regional connectivity, which Pakistan will not allow. If there is a regional connectivity, yes, there can be talks. And last point on the BRI issue is India's, this thing to BRI is on 2 issues. One is on the sovereignty issue, and the second is on the functional efficacy of the BRI. It is not transparent. There are no loans and assistance being given. It is being done by Chinese for the Chinese and to use the Chinese access capacities. And every country, again go back to the report I was referring to, it's an interesting report, that again, this thing is that every country is feeling the compulsions of managing the debt that they are incurring as part of the BRI. So the question today basically is this: how do we do it? And therefore, we have taught another initiative. I'm sure you are aware of that we have initiatives in Southeast Asia, along with the Japanese and now with the Americans coming in, and other players, Vietnam and other countries included. So there are alternative arrangements being made, not so much to overturn the BRI, but to help to develop regional connectivity initiatives which are government-owned, owned by the people of those countries, rather than driven from the back-end Chinese aspects. Thank you.
So on your question of is SARC dead or alive, I would argue that it's not dead, it's just defunct. If it was dead, China wouldn't have waited all these years to become an observer state. I think that also brings into perspective. It's just that it needs the rise of the phoenix, that's it. And on the question of Commodore Vasan, that India, there are limitations that why India is not engaged with its neighborhood. So we have been giving this limitation all this while, and that's what got China into perspective. If we always keep arguing limitations, 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 that's where I argue that India needs to be proactive. You need to think out of the box. And at this time frame, I just have a suggestion, like, you can go for a joint partnership and go for a third country investment where you can see your immediate neighbors. You don't have to go it solo, but you have other institutions, like India is very much party to AIIB, BRICS, NDB. So these institutions can be put into place, and how you can then chalk out a plan. So I think so that would be something I could recommend. Thank you.
In response to Carl's issue in terms of Europe, but I think globally, and an issue that came up, in which there's substantial empirical evidence in terms of China vis-a-vis India and its presence in the world in forms like this, but also increasingly embedded, and in fact controlling major global institutions, that India is pretty much absent. The empirical evidence is that if you compare delegations from India to China or the US, those countries, China sends 175 people, US may send 100, India sends a handful. And so, and in terms of, in the past have pointed out that in terms of these summits, there is very little presence of India institutions. So, Carl, it's not surprising in Europe and elsewhere that the presence and impact of India is not being felt in the public diplomacy. And I would add that one of the key things in terms of India is in public diplomacy, there are significant strategic assets and comparison between India and China, which are quite significant and under-articulated. China's controlling the sea lanes and the narrative, and I think the reality is, and the historical reality in terms of international relations, he or she who controls the sea lanes controls the world. China has already done that. Those chess moves have already been made, and most of the world is asleep at that. And so the point of proactivity, and the reality is, China's doing that, as all great powers, to control and have the resources it needs. Absolutely. The question is India doing that, aware of that? Is the government supporting that? You know, I teach international relations, and I have a course that I teach in the spring in terms of this transition. I once thought that there would be two banks in Asia, the Asia Development Bank, controlled by the Japanese, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which would be controlled by the Chinese. The reality is that the Chinese now control both. Yes. And so, you know, this game is over. And the reality will be either anticipated and proactive by India or thrust upon it, which is not what you want. And I think part of the importance of this forum is realizing that and crafting a very sophisticated, nuanced policy that doesn't terrify your neighbors, which is not what India has done, and a strategic asset. Those things really need to be articulated and managed in a way that I don't think has taken place, and now is the time to do that.
Can I just make a small Jim, I take your point fully, and all I can tell you is that we are cognizant of this, particularly at think tank level, and we have had enough discussions based on that, and we are in continuous evolution of policy initiatives to ensure that the space is not lost completely, and certainly Indian Ocean does not become a Chinese lake.
And I think the discourse at the think tank level in India has been quite vibrant on China. I think at times the challenge has been how do you then make it effective in terms of policy, and what sort of policy interventions do you need from that space. And I think that space we still are working on. But I think as the two speakers here tell you, the story about China is relatively simple in India. You understand it. I think the argument is how do you get it into a policy framework, and I don't think that's very different from some of the challenges that perhaps European countries have been facing, or even America is facing. It's only America. If you see today's America's China policy under Trump, it's quite
I wouldn't present the U.S. as a model for what you should emulate at this point.
No, I'm just saying that evolution in terms of thinking, that in America you always had this debate between those who wanted to integrate China, those who wanted to contain China. Today you seem to be moving towards more of a containment, and I think that shows you the policy discourse shifting. And I think that is something very similar happening in India. How do you manage that transition, I think, is the question. I think we have a few questions. I'll just go at the back and then we'll come. Yes.
Thank you very much. Both the speakers, they have highlighted there is a need and necessity to have proactive neighborhood policies. And you have mentioned about SARC is defunct, and highlighted about BBIN and BIMSTEC and other sub-regional cooperation. Just I wonder, what happened to BCIM? ORF has done excellent work on BCIM having interactive session in different places. And we too have done something in Northeastern region. As I'm coming from the northeastern part of India, which is craving for development, craving for connectivity, craving for infrastructure facilities, just I would like to know from both the speakers where we stand as far as the BCIM is concerned. Thank you.
I think we had a very interesting discussion, and what comes out from the conversation is Indian policy has been more focused on China, and thereby remains a huge gap on what we do in other parts of the world, be it EU, be it Latin America, be it areas which I've not paid attention to. So my question to the speakers is, when India is positioning itself as an anchor of a rules-based order, how does India do so, given the fact that India has not taken position on many issues? And the second is, I'm really curious to know what are the elements of an Indian consensus in the global political framework that we are talking now. There are many opportunities India has at the moment. It could partner with like-minded countries. One could be Germany, other countries in Europe. We could look at a multilateral order, a concert of multilateral countries called multilateralists, or even a concert of democracies, as we are talking about the democratic dividend this country has. So there is this gap between what is being thought strategically and understanding and acting on it. So you see a huge gap when it comes to leadership, be it in the neighborhood. For instance, you talked about Afghanistan. There's so much of work India has done there, but when push comes to shove, India doesn't take a position on issues. So that's when the problem arises. And as strategic community, as think tankers, you do put forward ideas and novel suggestions which you have been talking about, but how much of it has been taken? So the whole question is, what really is the Indian consensus then? Thank you.
Well, this has been a very fascinating session, and we have begun, I think, right on the right note of addressing the global challenges first. Jim had some very interesting points regarding the Indian think tanks' capacity building, global engagement, and of course, the role of public diplomacy. I hope we'll come back to those issues later in the just after lunch session, I think. Hopefully we'll address that. But in this particular session, the question of addressing the global challenges and the Indian views on that in articulating and shaping, in a sense, the global agenda, the dialogue, shaping the discourse, I think is also absent. In this session, perhaps we need to focus a bit more on that. Our obsession with China, in a sense, strategically, and a single point policy towards China, our policy towards the neighborhood, once again, in a very limited way, constrains and limits our engagement with the world. We have to look at the larger especially the Indo-Pacific, if not the global environment, in a much more constructive manner. And this is a challenge for the think tanks, particularly in India. We are also largely absent in that debate. We are not engaging in trying to understand how the environment is emerging, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but also globally. We are not throwing up enough options and alternatives. We have a single point agenda regarding China, strategic position, also against Pakistan, that restricts, limits, does not leave out space for options and opportunities. I would just like to draw your attention to the wonderful speech highlighted by Rajiv also in the keynote address that Prime Minister made on the 1st of June at the Shangri-La dialogue, spelling out in the broadest context the whole Indian policy towards the Indo-Pacific in particular. However, within the think tank community, there is not enough dialogue or discussion on those questions, setting out alternative policies perhaps, expanding on the ideas that the Prime Minister so brilliantly articulated. His policy towards China is distinctly different from what was said in Shangri-La and that what emerges normally, naturally, within our media and our so-called think tank community, not the major ones. And so therefore this challenge, as Rajiv once again mentioned, 3 decades from now, we're likely to be the 3rd largest economy, purchasing power parity or capital exchange rate, whatever you take it, more or less about that. But in the larger way, are we helping think tank communities here? Are they contributing to the debate to shape the policies that we'll need to adopt in India to get us there? And having reached there, willy-nilly, inevitably, whatever, what do we do about it? So these debates must be ones that must engage the think tank community, and not just a single point agenda, expanding perhaps the Prime Minister's or others' points of view, the space perhaps for that, but to throw up choices, options, alternatives, discussions. And that is where, that is the complaint that European or the others, perhaps the US also, have regarding the Indian think tank's response. Articulate policies, limited fashion, single point agenda, but not enough discussion and deliberations. That, I think, is a larger challenge that we need to understand and confront. Thank you.
So we have to break for coffee, but I have 2 more questions, I think, from the floor.
Thank you, Harsh, and thank you very much to the 2 fantastic speakers on a very powerful, thought-provoking presentation. I just have 2 questions, maybe just to add a little bit of fuel to the fire. India's heading to elections in May, and I'm wondering how you foresee election politics, or how you actually can ensure sustainability of the ideas presented through the various potential it's adding to the turbulence, obviously, given their elections. There's sort of another element that hasn't been mentioned, but it's coming quite close, and I was just somewhat surprised that there was no mention of it, given that it's, I think, quite an important piece of the discussion. That's just my first observation slash question. Obviously, I come from outside. The other question is just, given that you have a representation, my friend and colleague Carol has already mentioned the role of European think tanks of the EU. He spoke more of the EU, but we have a representation here of quite serious, ESP, of quite sort of significant think tanks in Europe. What sort of role and collaboration do you see for this forum, for think tank thinking in terms of sustainability of ideas and cooperation into the future that will cut through transitions, given the turbulence, cut through transitions of governments, because not through all the other, because we have to think, irrespective of who's going to be in power, how do we sustain a movement that will shed some positive light and find mechanism to deal with all the ideas that were raised from the keynote discussion through I won't raise all the points, we've all noted them both mentally and I assume in other places too. So the question just is, we were looking for future sustainability of these ideas, moving into shaping them into concrete forums that will be able to be implemented through different governments. And, I'm not suggesting there'll be another government here at all, but just, I think one has to be open to that idea. Thank you.
Yes, sir, the final question.
This is to both the panelists. I'm rather very confused. Confused in the sense that what type of message are we trying to send through our foreign policy? And what type of, we can say, the type of image we are trying to send across? Because India always had that image of a dove from Nehru era, then Mrs. Gandhi's era, and now Modi's era. Are we trying to become a hawk, or we're still persisting to be a dove, or we are trying to be Buddha, a middle path, or we are just trying to be a good business like national interest? We are seeing wherever our national interest matters. So we have a graded diplomacy. And of course, as it has come out, SARC is defunct and we are ignoring our neighbors. So conceptually, I would like to ask specifically Arun Sahgal Sahab that how do you focus in foreign policy today, as of now, and how do you put it in a paradigm framework? Thank you.
So lots of questions and very brief answers.
Yeah, no, I'll start with the last one first. I draw your attention to what the Prime Minister said about India's foreign policy. One word, two words, India first. That's the policy. He said so in his remarks. He said India first, which basically means is India's strategic security and economic interests will define India's policy options. And I also said in my remarks to say upholding of the international order in sync with Indian interests is the credible route that India will follow. Everything else will flow from it. There is no one aspect to deal with. A particular area, B particular area, C particular area. All will be defined in terms of India's interests. As far as Delhi consensus is concerned, all I will turn and say is that, look, we can have huge ideas and huge understanding, but from my perspective, from a realist perspective, is that what I'm looking at is we are trying to create an Asian consensus. Asian consensus that we are trying to create is a rule-based consensus where international rules will be upheld. There will be no domination by anybody and no coercion, and everybody will be able to live as important partner and an equally important player. This is being important from India to ensure that there is a certain degree of peace and stability in Asia. If we can achieve this much working with our other partners, and here I'm looking in terms of partnerships, in terms of Australia, in terms of Japan, I'm talking about the ASEAN countries, I'm talking about the West Asia, I'm talking about Russia as our partner in Central Asia, and also including China. If we can all come together to understand that strategic coercion, assertiveness has no role to play, we would have achieved something. On broader aspects of global issues, etc., their economic issues, we are still grappling with them. I mean, the point is very simple. You can't get RCEP negotiations to move forward. Why can't you get the RCEP negotiations to move forward? What are these consensuses we are talking about? So the question is, we have to limit our aspirations to our capacities and capabilities. And here again, I like to quote what I said, is that we legitimize multipolarity and inclusive security architecture on the central norm of upholding sovereignty. For us, sovereignty issues are very important. For the larger global players, sovereignty issues are not important. Sovereignty issues are given. So that's an important issue that I'd like to, as far as the larger issues raised by General Banerjee, we can discuss them. I mean, the point again, sir, basically is this, that India is not, and I like to highlight it in most assertive manner, we are not focusing ourselves on China. We recognize China as a strategic challenger, but China is not be all and end all of our strategic aspirations or our strategic focus. We are looking at a rule-based order in Asia and by extension globally. There is enough focus on Africa, like the Africa Growth Corridor indicates, and multiple initiatives that we have taken. We are member of the SCO. The logic and the rationale is we talk about multipolarity with the Russians. We talk about a global commons and a international order with the Americans. We try to uphold the sanctity of the maritime commons. So the question basically is this, that India is involved in a multi-pronged strategic thinking which is not focused in one area. That's something, there's a misperception in our part if we look at it from that perspective. Thank you.
To Dr. D'Souza's question that what kind of a rules-based order is India looking at? And where you rightly pointed that, we are so obsessed with China, but we have done a bit in various other quarters, but when it comes to talking, we just highlight the great power initiatives. To that, I would like to argue that for now, since India is now engaging and becoming, like taking responsibility in this broader discourse of rules-based order, the very factor that anchors India's engagement is inclusivity, which India is projecting at the maximum, and which also got highlighted in the Shangri-La dialogue by Prime Minister Modi. So inclusivity itself says that it's all encompassing. That's where you are not differentiating. And that's also was where I put forward that, that my understanding that it's not just about China, but India should look beyond, far and beyond, and it's just, that's where I projected that small countries do matter. It's not the size, but you need to go beyond. You have to diversify your interest basket, and China is just a strategic challenge. So the key strategic challenge is China, but your strategic interests are varied and it's always evolving. Thank you.
So thank you both Brigadier Sagal and Dr. Jash, and I would just briefly point out that this is, for India, this is a young conversation. This is, conversations about India's global role is something that is relatively new in the think tank world. We were, even if you go back a decade, we were so focused on Pakistan that almost every conversation would begin and end on Pakistan. I think there is a evolution. If today we are joined here in a group and we have hardly mentioned Pakistan, we have moved on. I think there are bigger issues on the table. So the agenda of India's global engagement is widening, and I think this is a young conversation. So I think we should take it in that spirit. And we cannot really compare ourselves to what is happening in, for example, even in Washington or in Europe or even in China. But I think the evolution is similar. The trajectory is similar. The conversations are becoming wider. The conversations are becoming about larger strategic issues that go beyond just South Asia and Indian Ocean region to China, to Southeast Asia, to Africa and Latin America. And I think if we take it in that spirit, we will see that this has been a positive evolution, and perhaps some role has been in this process has been played by think tanks. Some of them have been very old, like IPCS. Some of them relatively new, like ORF. And I think that is a challenge that we all will take forward. And I think a part of this conversation would also be a part of our subsequent conversations later on today. But with that, let me end this panel and thank both our speakers for their excellent presentations. Thank you so much.